Hello, it is now time to talk about cluster analysis. If you remember, unsupervised machine learning has to do with finding patterns or groups within the data. Here, looking at our diagram, you'll remember that under unsupervised learning, we are going to be talking about two different types, association and cluster analysis. We already talked about association rules, that was last time, and that had to do with finding items that seem to be associated with each other. So now it's time for us to talk about cluster analysis, which is finding groups such that items in each group are more like each other than objects in the other groups. In this scatter plot below, you'll see that there are three natural groupings. And what that might indicate is that maybe items within each group are similar to each other in some way and different from observations in the other groups also in some way. We would call these groups clusters, and there are reasons why we might want to be able to identify clusters within our data. Now, since this is a two-dimensional graph, it's easy for us to look and see, oh, I see three different groups. It's definitely more difficult when you add dimensions. You can imagine a three-dimensional graph where you might be able to, if you could see the graph in 3 dimensions, you might be able to find groups that way. But when it gets into more dimensions, like 4 dimensions, 5 dimensions, and so on, then it's impossible for us to imagine. So this would be a time where we would want to use machine learning to help us find the different clusters. There's several different algorithms that can be used, and we're going to look at one of them today. But first, let's think about what would be the advantage of being able to identify clusters. Well, maybe if we have, if we're a company and we have different marketing campaigns and we have a lot of different customers, maybe we would like to be able to have different marketing campaigns for customers in different clusters, because customers inside a particular cluster might have similar preferences. Or maybe they have different purchasing habits, and so different business strategies could be used. Or maybe customers might be clustered related to location or even interests. And then a different marketing campaign could be used with them, or just different ways to communicate, or different strategies would be used for the different clusters. Here's a picture that I found on a website that was actually talking about working with cluster analysis, and I thought it was a good little picture here. It showed this two-dimensional graph of the age of some people, customers, and then their spending habits, how much they spent. I don't even know what this means, like per month, or what this has to do with. And you can look at the link down there to look and see what it's all about. If you do look at that link, they are talking about how to perform this algorithm that we're going to be learning, how to perform it using the R language. And we've been using Python when it comes to computer languages. So you probably won't recognize a lot of the information there, but this picture is basically all I wanted to get out of that. But look at this here. So the age is along the bottom and the spending habits is along the top. And there seems to be, they have identified 3 clusters. The lower left one that's has a red rectangle around it would represent younger people who aren't spending a whole lot. And then let's go over to the green on the very right. These would be older people who aren't spending a whole lot, maybe a little bit more than the younger people. And then in the middle here at the top is the middle-aged people who would maybe be at the height of their careers and would have maybe more money to spend. And so those would be the middle-aged people with a higher budget. So it's possible, not that people always fall into one of those groups, but maybe a company, when analyzing their customers, they might find that maybe their customers do tend to fall into these different groups. That would be very beneficial for them to understand that, and then to be able to identify these customers and then target these customers in different ways. Cluster analysis can also be used in detecting patterns in images, diagnosing illnesses, distinguishing types not yet identified, and grouping inventory in certain ways. Those are just some ways, and there are many other ways when cluster analysis can be used. In this lesson, we're going to talk about K-means clustering. And this is an algorithm that we can use to find clusters within our data. In this algorithm, K means the number of clusters that we are expecting. So just like K nearest neighbors, where we had to decide we're going to use the 3 nearest neighbors or the 5 nearest neighbors, here we have to decide up front what we want K to be. Now, sometimes it's obvious how many clusters we're going to have, but sometimes it's not. So a lot of times it's not. So often what we have to do is experiment with the different numbers of K and see which of those models that we've created ends up being the better models. So that's what we would do. So anyway, this is an algorithm that it really takes a visualization to be able to really understand it, and there's this great visualization online that you see the link right there. So I'm going to go to that link and talk through this algorithm by showing you that. So this visualization comes from an article called Visualizing K-Means Clustering. And so here I've started with a data set that, assuming that maybe we had plotted it in a scatter plot with an x-axis and a y-axis, maybe we would get something like this. Obviously to us, it looks like there would be 3 clusters, very clear clusters, but as I've said before, sometimes when we have more than just 2 dimensions, it gets to be impossible to really actually visualize that, and so that's when we would need to use some kind of algorithm in order to be able to find the clusters. But let's just stay with this simple example where we could have done it on our own in this case, but we'll see. Starting with a simple example like this, we see how the algorithm is done, and then we understand that that can be done when things get more complicated too. Okay, so I'm going to say that I'm going to assume that there are 3 clusters. And again, as I've said, that's something you have to decide up front. And sometimes it's not obvious, and we would have to play around with different sizes for K in order to come up with the best model. But in this case, this is simple. I know there's 3. So we start with what are called just 3 different points on the plane here. And I'm going to just drop 3 points. Usually within the algorithm, it's started as the points are randomly chosen on the plane. But I'm going to just kind of throw some here. Obviously, I could guess where the center of my clusters are. There, and there, but I'm going to pretend like I don't see this and just put 3 dots just anywhere on the screen. Okay, so I'm going to say 1 dot is here, then I'm going to put another dot maybe over here, again assuming I'm not really seeing the clusters yet, and I'll put 1 there. Okay, so again, if we couldn't see it yet, we're just going to put 3 dots somewhere, and so far they're not the center of the clusters, but if we use this algorithm, we will eventually find the centers of these clusters, okay, and then be able to then classify each of the points as being part of a certain cluster. Okay, so now I'm going to click on the Go button here, and what's going to happen for this first step is we're going to look and see which points are closest to, let's put it this way. We're going to look at each dot that I've put there and find the points that are closer to it than closer to the other dots. So I'm going to click on Go, and you see that all of these dots up here that are red, they're closer to the red dot than they are to the green dot or the blue dot. But the ones that are blue are closer to the blue dot than they are to the others. And the ones that are green are the ones closer to the green dot than to the others. Okay, so what we've done is assigned our points to the different what we would consider at this point clusters, although it's not the right clusters. But so we've got blue points, red points, and green points. Now we're going to perform the next step, which is called updating the centroids. What that's going to do is, now let's just say the red dots, all the red dots, ignoring my big red dot that I just placed there originally. But look at all the actual data points that are red. I'm going to find the center of those points, meaning, and that's called the centroid. And if I find the average X value and find the average Y value of just those red dots, that would give me the centroid of those dots. Then I'm going to also go at the same time and find the centroid of the blue dots. Notice I'm not, next to those blue dots there are some green dots very close, but I don't get to consider those right now. I'm only going to look at the blue dots and find the center of those blue dots. And then same thing for the green dots. Find the center, the centroid of those. Take the average of the X's and Y's and find the centroid of the green dots too. So the next step, I'm going to click on this update centroids, and we'll see that we have new dots here as our new centroid. So here I click. Okay, and what we would expect, that's we got the middle of the red dots, the middle of the blue dots, and then the green dots, there's some over here and some over here. So the average X and Y, if we would find that, would put us right here. Now, it's not quite good enough yet, because we've got some green dots over here that really belong in this cluster over here with the blue. So we've only done one iteration of this algorithm, which was to randomly place some dots, assign points to those the points closest to each dot, and then once we do that, then we find the centroid of each of those sets. So we've done that once, but now we will do it again. And the next step then is to go again and reassign the points. So now I'm going to look at, let's just look at the blue dot and see all those green dots close to the blue dot. Well, in this step, we just we reassign the points. Any point that's closer to the blue dot than to any of the other two dots, we're going to make it blue. And same thing with the red dots and the green dots. Okay, so there's a lot of green dots over here that are close, very close to the blue dot. And because of that, they're going to get reassigned into blue dots. Okay, so again, check to see for each dot which centroid is it closest to, and we'll reassign the color based on that. So I'll click that. Now we see that it looks like these three clusters have been identified, but we'll keep going just to make sure. So we'll click update centroids again. Again, what that's going to do is each color of cluster there, it's going to find the center of it. And now we'll find that it gets to be stable. in that the more we go over and over and over this, it stays the same. So if I were to reassign points, I'll see nothing gets reassigned because everything is correct. And then I update centroids. Again, it's all it's not going to change anything. So we've come to a stable point, and therefore we would say we have separated our data into 3 different clusters. And so for each observation, we would be able to say, is this observation part of the red cluster or the green cluster or the blue cluster? Now let's do it again. This we can see that looks like maybe there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 clusters. And so let's go ahead and assign the centroids. Now I think I have set this here a minute ago when I set up this one. I said to start with those dots, have them be placed randomly. So I'm not going to place them. I'm going to see what kind of random situation I have. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We need one more. Okay, so that's randomly assigned 7 dots that we start out with. And now we're going to see if this algorithm works for us. We would hope that eventually we find our way to those 7 clusters where it's clusters around in a circle, and then there's a cluster in the middle too. So remember, the first step would be to assign points based on which large dot the points are closest to. So everything in the red area is going to be turned into red dots, and so on. So I'll click go, and now we have some blue dots, red dots, yellow dots, and so on. It has not found the correct clusters yet, and we would know that because we would go through several steps, several iterations of these steps in this algorithm, and as long as the centroids are changing, we know that the correct clusters haven't been found yet. Okay, so the first step then is to assign the points like that. Now the next step is to adjust the centroids, update the centroids, because remember, now what we're going to do is look at all points of a certain color and find the centroid of it. What's the average position of the blue, what's the average position of the black, and so on. So you can imagine where these are going to go. This black one is going to go somewhere in the center of that gray triangle. The green one's going to be updated and be more into the center of that green shaded area, and so on. So let's go ahead and click the update centroids. Okay, and it looks like it's starting to find these clusters, although there are some problems up here. Anyway, now that we have found the centroids, now we need to reassign the points. So now we will look and see look at the big red dot. Which points are closer to the red dot than they are to the other points? Those are going to now be reassigned to be red. So there's some blue points in that red shaded area that used to be closest to our previous blue point. But now that we've updated the position of our centroids, we see that now those few blue points are closer to the red dot than they are to that blue dot. And same thing with over in the yellow shaded region. There's some green dots that used to be closer to the green dot than they were to the yellow dot, but now that we've updated the centroids, we see that now those green dots are closer to the yellow dot. Okay, so now I'm going to reassign the points, and we see now the colors are correct based on what shaded region they're in. Okay, still hasn't quite found the right, what we would consider the right clusters, and so we'll keep going. update the centroids again and now reassign points. So it's just going back and forth between these two steps, and update centroids again, reassign points, and it's going to take just a little while until we go back and forth until we get to a stable position where nothing is changing. Okay, now I'm continuing to click this, but nothing's changing because now it's stable and we have found our clusters. Those clusters around in the circle and then the cluster inside have been found. And so again, it was just a matter of going through these two steps over and over and over until we find the clusters. Now occasionally you'll get to if these points, these initial points are created at random, occasionally it'll go somewhere where then there's not a clear, it doesn't find him. So don't worry about that. I think what we're going to be doing, the tools that we're going to be using to find these clustering, it'll make sure that if it's a bad position and doesn't come and find the clusters, then it would try some other positions until it found that it worked. Now let's see how KNIME would perform cluster analysis. I have a file that I found out on a website. You see the URL up there, and it is an artificially constructed data set that is going to end up looking like this. You see a picture where there are 3 distinct clusters. Again, with these very easy two-dimensional situations like this, it's easy to tell in just two dimensions whether there actually are clusters or not. And it's not always that easy when there's more dimensions involved. But anyway, this one is one of those where it's obvious to us that there are 3 clusters, but let's see if we can find out and make sure that KNIME will be able to find those same clusters. And then we want KNIME then to be able to take some new data possibly and run it through the model and see if it could tell, based upon the measurements of a new observation, if it could tell which cluster it would belong into. Okay, so now the name of the data set is xClara CSV. So if you can go to Canvas and download that, then go ahead and open KNIME, and I'll go ahead and show you what we can do to perform this K-means clustering within KNIME. So I first of all brought in the CSV reader and set it up to go and look at this xClara. Now you can take a look at it ahead of time, but you would find out that it does have a row header. So that's good. Make sure you go ahead and say that then, and then say OK. And then I dragged over a scatter plot just so that we can verify what it looks like before we go ahead and try to do something. Now, if I type scatter plot over here in order to try to find it, there's this JavaScript scatter plot, and then there's this scatter plot local. And in the past, I don't remember that there were these 2 possibilities, and normally we choose the one that doesn't have something in parentheses afterwards, but the one that says scatterplot local is the one that I'm used to seeing in the past, and it's the one that I like because it has an interactive display where you can pull up the scatterplot and then change which variables you want to look for and be able to do that right then and there while you're actually looking at the scatterplot. So I like that one best. So I dragged over this scatterplot local and went ahead and configured it. Let's see. Oh, one thing is when it starts out like this, 2500, that's kind of the default. It's going to see the top 2500 records. But if you try to execute it, you get this little exclamation mark. And then down here, it says only the first 2,500 rows are displayed. So that made me realize, let's go ahead and configure this so that more records will be displayed. So this says number of rows to display. Let's go ahead and set that up to, and I don't know how many are actually in the data set, but if I set that up to 4,000, then I don't end up getting that error. So I know that it's got them all. Okay, so now I have that. Let's go ahead and look at the scatter plot here. In this case here, there's only two dimensions anyway. There's a V1 and a V2, and that's the only ones. So we didn't have to really do any playing around with that at all. But anyway, you see here, yes, it does appear that there are three fairly obvious clusters, and we want to see if KNIME can recognize that, and if we send in some other data, will KNIME be able to put a new observation into one of these clusters. Okay, so that was just to show you what the data look like. Let's go ahead and drag over the K-means. Oh, no, sorry. Let's partition this first, so that we can actually have a test set and a train set. So go ahead and do this. Right click, configure. Let's go 80% for that first, for the train set, and execute. Now let's go ahead and drag over a K-means. If I search like this, K-means, it doesn't show up, but I have K-means. You see it's over here under clustering. So we'll drag that over, and let's send the training set into K-means. Let's configure this. It's asking how many clusters. Well, we can tell it's 3 because we know what the data looks like. Again, if there's more than 2 dimensions, we could still look at the scatter plot and see if we could try to figure it out. But it's, sometimes it's hard to tell. So as I said before, you would just kind of experiment with different numbers of clusters, and hopefully then find one a model that seems to work better than the others. Okay, so anyway, there's only two variables anyway, and so of course we would want to include both of those in trying to decide what the clusters are. So we'll choose 3 for K, and then use both of those variables, V1 and V2. And execute. Now let's see what we would be able to look at here now that we've executed that. We can come down here and look at labeled input. And you see that in the original data there were only V1 and V2, but here now it's gone ahead and put each of these points into a cluster. So there's ones in cluster 1, there's some in cluster 2, and 0, 1, 0, and 2. That's how they've labeled those. So we can look at that. Let's see what else we can look at here. Clusters. It just explains, it says how many clusters there are, and says that must be the mean, I think. Here's the lower bound, upper bound. Yeah, so I hadn't looked at that yet, so I'm not sure, but I guess that is that's the mean of all of those, the different points. Okay, now let's see, one other thing. Oh, this isn't going to really help us too much. You can look at that. Yeah, that's not going to help us, so let's ignore that. Okay, so now what we would want to do, let's go ahead and pull out pull over the scatter plot. No, let's do Color Manager first. Color Manager, we can use that in order to say we want all of our dots in one cluster to be a certain color and the other clusters be different colors. So let's go ahead and configure that. And we've got 3 colors here. That brown, it's a little, I don't know, I think might be nicer to have a different color. Let's go with blue maybe. We'll see how that looks. Okay, now I'll execute. And then when I take a look at, well, first of all, you can look at the table with colors, and you can see that all it's done is where it's cluster 1, they have red. Oh, here's a cluster 2 right in the middle, and so that's blue, and so on. So, but if we want to see it on the, let's see, color settings. Okay, if we want to see it on the actual plot, then we have to drag over a scatter plot. So scatter plot, and I'll do the scatter plot local because that's the one I'm used to using. And configure, again, let's use number of rows to display. Let's do 4,000 just so that we'll get them all. And execute. And let's take a look at the scatter plot. Now, look at that. That looks very nice. What's been done is not only are the original data points plotted, but we used a K-means algorithm in order to put these into different clusters, and then based on that, we made them turn into different colors, and then we can see them here. So it looks good. It looks like it worked pretty well there. Okay, now we also have the test set that we might want to take a look at. And so here's what we can do. There's something called a cluster assigner. So let's pull that over. And the cluster assigner needs to have a model coming into the top and data coming into the bottom. So we're going to put the model that we've created using this K-means algorithm. We're going to bring that into the cluster assigner, and then we're going to bring the data from the test set into the cluster assigner. Let's execute that and see if we can see what it did. Remember that what's coming out of the partition, let's go ahead and look at it here, second partition. This is what the data looks like. It just has V1s and V2s. But after we use this cluster assigner, it's going to use that K-means model that we've created to put each of these values into its own cluster. So now let's look at the assigned data, and you see that it's gone ahead now and added a row for cluster. And so not only does it have the V1 and V2, but it says which cluster each point is in. Okay, now let's just go ahead and look at that and see what that looks like, and see if it looks kind of similar to what we have before. So I'm going to drag over another color manager and another scatter plot. Instead of trying to drag everything over, I'm going to do a copy and paste. So I'm going to copy this and paste, and that way it's a little bit easier. And here I'm going to copy the scatter plot and paste. So for this color manager, let's see here. Okay, the colors are still good. Like I think I like them better than the default. So I'll go ahead and execute that. And now let's execute the scatter plot, and let's look at that. Okay, so there were fewer points because this was 20% of the data was held out as points to be used in the test set. And so then it looks like that 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 model worked pretty well. These new values that came in, it looks like that model put the points into the correct clusters. So that is how we can do cluster analysis using K-means using KNIME. I'm going to have you have a lab. I'm going to, for a lab, give you another data set and have you do something similar to this just so you can get some practice working with KNIME and K-means. One thing also that I want you to know is, besides being able to use KNIME here for this, I also want you to just to understand that algorithm and how it works, just as far as how it goes from, randomly assigning some points and then assigning all of the data points to be those that are closest to those new points that we just added, and then once we do that, then we find a new centroid for each cluster and so on. So what we've just gone through in the previous two examples, just understand that, so that if you were asked something about that on the test, you would understand what's going on there.